Good morning. This video is meant to explain the essay Romanticism, the Brief History of a Concept by Seamus Perry. Professor Seamus Perry has worked on the Romantic poets, Coleridge and Wordsworth, as well as post Romantic English poets like Tennyson, Auden, Eliot, and Larkin. He is also interested in modern history of literary criticism, having written articles, essays on literary critics and scholars like M.H. Abrams, F.W. Bateson, A.C. Bradley, and William Empson. Now, we first tackle the problem of Romanticism. This essay writes the history of the concept of Romanticism. The introduction to the book, A Companion to Romanticism, edited by Duncan Wu, mentions the rewriting of the canon. Canon, as in the established characteristics which define any movement. With the passage of time, more and more writers began to be included in the group of romantics, besides the big names like Wordsworth, Byron, Blake, Coleridge, and Keats. Anthologies of only women poets as romantic began to be published in the 1990s, so it was bound to make a difference to established opinions about what defines romanticism. Feminism and new historicism, which were new ways of analyzing critical texts, after the early 80s began to offer an alternative to the conventional M.H. Abrams theory or deconstruction, which had begun to make its presence felt then. Seamus Perry thus calls Romanticism as a concept troublesome or as a problem, though advises one not to stress too much on deriving perfect and complete definitions of what makes one a romantic writer. He calls the process of deriving a correct definition of Romanticism a circular one, or rather hermeneutic circle, named so by David Perkins, open to a variety of interpretations and dynamic. One names a writer, forms a concept or notion or idea about him or her, then draws in similar writers into a group, and that forms the canon, which is a set of principles by which these writers seem to belong in the same category. It is circular because the theorist, critic, researcher is constantly moving from concept to canon and vice versa. So, the better way is to have a Platonic idea free of any canonical or conceptual assumptions. The characteristics of a writer is to be acknowledged with no prior assumptions. Platonic realism is a theory attributed to Greek philosopher Plato, who believed that universals and abstract objects exist objectively and outside human minds. To approach a work free of assumptions is the best approach. Thomas Macfarlane lists about 15 characteristics of Romanticism. All these seem to contradict each other. The Romantic writer is supposed to have a love for the infinite as well as the particular. He loves the external nature but is also preoccupied with dreams. So, how is one supposed to define Romanticism, which seems so full of contrariness, so full of contradictions? So, the history of this concept is troublesome as well as a history of revision, fluctuating, changing, dynamic, according to the age in which it is being evaluated. In all this shifting perspectives, poets who have evoked surprise at being romantic are Blake and Scott. Others have expressed shock at Byron not being included as a romantic poet. According to Seamus Perry, assumption of unifying qualities in all these very individual poets is to fall victim to an optical illusion or a pun. He hopes that someday a consensus will be reached, not about the exactness of the nature of Romanticism, but the fact that the word romantic has been made to include and exclude incongruity among certain categories of writers who happen to exist in the same time frame and display similar as well as disparate ideologies. So it is rather ironical what romantic has been made to do. The making of Romanticism. The first meaning that comes to mind in the present age when you hear the word romantic is something to do with romance, or what we would call the love relationship between man and woman. But according to the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, this meaning of romantic as in love affair is of recent origin, that is the 20th century. The word romantic in the early 17th century was used to describe tales of romance. It is described in Samuel Johnson's first dictionary of the English language, published in 1775. None of the Romantic poets would have liked to be so named, posthumously or otherwise. During their life, they were called the Lake Poets, the Demonic Poets, the School. Coleridge, Wordsworth, Robert Southey lived around the Lake District of England, and so they were named so. Byron and Shelley were called the demonic poets or the satanic poets because of their audacious, satanic pride, irreverence, and arrogance in their style of writing. They were so named by Robert Southey, Leigh Hunt, William Hazlitt, John Keats, were called the Cockney school of poets. The Cockney is the working class speech, unrefined, low diction, and lacking sophistication. These poets would not have imagined in their wildest dreams that they would be described as romantic poets in the latter years. Tales of romance connote implications of fantasy, unreal, improbable, wild, and pertaining to the supernatural world. Matters of the heart and matters of the brain have been universally accepted as opposed to each other. Thus, anything which leans towards the heart, the impulses, dreams, fantasies, unpremeditated action, spontaneity, has been called romantic always. Coleridge would have liked to be called a romantic poet because his works deal with supernatural events, having to do with the fantastical imaginative power which takes the reader from the real world to a world of Kubla Khan and the ancient mariner, where incidents happen for which the rational, logical mind cannot provide a scientific reason. This Coleridge felt was necessary for the young reading minds to indulge in order to develop a strong creative and imaginative mind, which was essential to expand mental faculties and hold their future in good stead. While his collaboration with Wordsworth for lyrical ballads included his tales of fantasy, Wordsworth wrote on everyday incidents pertaining to the real world, to valleys of flowers, meadows of greenery, solitary singing lasses, steeped in the beauty for the senses to revel in, as well as containing some commonplace wisdom or lesson in them. And all of it in common man's language, uh, though not necessarily in the Cockney accent. Hippolyte Taine in 1863 was the first person to name the Lake Poets as a romantic school. This was a comparative study keeping French poets in mind with similar characteristics in their work. A similar comparison and study to liken German poets was made by Brandel. The improbable fact that Wordsworth also drew ideas from medieval history was also suggested in these studies. Henry Beers, in the end of the 19th century, wrote two books which very strongly advocates for Wordsworth as the most unromantic of poets, as compared to Scott and Coleridge. However, while in the 19th century this was an acceptable exclusion, in the 20th century perceptions had changed. Scott as romantic was a less palatable idea. Hopkins divided the Romantic poets in 1881 as Romantic School of Leigh Hunt, Keats, Hood, Scott, and Lake poets, with Wordsworth, and Sentimental School with Byron, Moore, etc. So Wordsworth was assigned to the Lake District, and that's where he was to remain until minds started changing in the 20th century. The prominence of current writers influenced the reframing of the canon, whereas Byron and Scott were regarded more in the preceding times. Wordsworth began gaining centrality in the later 19th and early 20th century. William Blake also started gaining more visibility. The label of romantic began to be more inclusive and accepting of those who were earlier eyed with suspicion as romantic writers. F.R. Lewis's New Bearings in English Poetry, 1932, and Grierson's rejection of the medieval criterion to redefine Romanticism in 1923 were significant works announcing the changes happening to the troublesome concept of Romanticism. It was thus announced by W.P. Kerr, an Oxford University professor, that Romantic writing was getting out of hand. He was grieving the fairy way of writing, which had defined Romanticism earlier, was on its way out. Idealism, primitives, egotism, and a turn to nature were characteristics that defined the Romantic now. Paul Deman talks about a genuine impasse or a deadlock in 1983 in the growing dissent over Romanticism. Did Romanticism emerge out of a reaction to the imposed period of Enlightenment? The Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason, was an intellectual and cultural movement in the 18th century that emphasized reason over superstition and science over blind faith. Rationalism is the idea that humans are capable of using their faculty of reason to gain knowledge. Did poets turn to naturalism as a reaction to enlightenment, or was it a subjective idealism? Subjective idealism, which emphasizes the relevance and preponderance of the mind, as opposed to enlightenment, which emphasizes on reason, rationality, and progress. Both are concerned with the individual, but the varying degrees of concern through emotions or realism is what decides their ideology. Walter Raleigh in 1903 calls Rousseau the father of the literary romantics, which was later endorsed by Irving Babbitt in 1919 and also by T.S. Eliot. In 1926, Lascelles Abercrombie said that the true antithesis is not between classicism and romanticism, but between romanticism and realism. There is a growing acknowledgement of the inner consciousness that marks the writing of the later 18th and 19th century writers. To remain confined within the workings of the inner being, the self, a growing reluctance to interact with the external, and egoism trait marked these writers. Naturalism finds its relevance in the nature poetry of the prominent Romantic writers. But what is naturalism after all? Naturalism sees ultimate truth ordained by nature. The predominance of nature, which reduces realism to insignificance, because man is created by nature and only to a certain extent capable of controlling his existence. So, to an extent, both subjective idealism and naturalism are the two faces of the same coin. The importance of the mind over all else has been stated by prominent romantics. Shelley's All things exist as they are perceived. Wordsworth's The mind is lord and master. Blake's Mental things are alone real point to the importance of subjective idealism as opposed to medieval mystery, fantasy, and the supernatural element of the previously dominant romantic definition. Some names particularly influential in reframing the canons of the Romantic are Harold Bloom, Northrop Frye, Abercrombie, Jerome Magan. The Romantic ideology in 1983 talks about a subjective idealism as a false consciousness par excellence. It is a Marxist materialist viewpoint which cuts across idealism rather brutally by accusing it of escapism through poetry and fantasies in order to escape from reality which demands a classless and with equally distributed goods society. Here, Byron is placed as a historically sanctioned Romantic poet, undeservedly edged out of the mainstream Romantic literature. To conclude, Romanticism is not a fixed object. You cannot conclude whole truth from presuppositions and interpretations by theorists and critics. It is always necessary to read literary history demarcations with an open mind. What political leaning of Wordsworth gets revealed through his poems, or what Taylor reveals through his translations of Plotinus, cannot be ideally substituted by readings and interpretations by third person scholars, critics, theorists, who can only gain a limited access to the workings of the actual author's mind. But academic literary history has to be defined or made comprehensible through labeling of movements or categories. M.H. Abrams talked about how Romanticism is a term that historians can neither do with nor do without. Shelley, in his defense of poetry, said, reason respects differences and imagination, the similitudes of things. So, the tussle of impulses is invariably present in literary history. Classification, like Romantic, helped to streamline an immense amount of literary creations of writers, and it is physically not possible to place judgments on individual poets or poems. The aim of finding an ultimate truth cannot be cluttered by too many self conflicting truths. So it is essential that all perspectives about the literary productivity between the period 1790 to 1830 has to be reasonably clubbed under both similarities and differences despite sameness of period. Thank you. I hope the video helps you all. Please get back if you have any doubts. Thank you so much.